Hi, everyone. I'm Heather McCullough, Senior Fellow and founder of Women in the Economy at the Aspen Financial Security Program. I'm so excited that you're here for the first of our series of dialogues with journalists, writers, filmmakers, and other thought leaders about the changing role of women in the economy and how to build an economy that works for all of us. The series is going to focus on the fact that women are playing a far different role in our economy than we have in the last 50 years as breadwinners, caregivers, entrepreneurs, investors, consumers, and consumers and caregivers. Yet still, so many of our economic systems were never designed with women in mind. That includes labor, tax, credit, and our retirement system. And in fact, even today, when policymakers and business leaders talk about the economic challenges facing women, they talk about them as women's issues or social issues instead of the core economic issues that they've become. So the future of women in the economy dialogues will explore the economic challenges women are facing, the solutions we envision, and we'll go deep on how we build a gender equitable economy that works for everyone. A gender equitable economy is really key at this point, not just for the financial security of families, but really for the growth and prosperity of our economy. And I want to just say at this point, when we're talking about women, we mean all female identifying people. We include everyone. So before I turn it over to our interviewees, I wanted just to have a moment for my partner in the series, Joanna Smith-Romani, to say a few words. Joanna?
Hello, thank you so much, Heather, and welcome everyone to Aspen FSP. I am personally, and we as a program are just thrilled and delighted to be working with Heather on this super important series. Our work at FSP at the Financial Security Program is deeply focused on how we build a more inclusive wealth building in the United States and really inclusive financial security. We think about gaps along racial lines, geographic lines, generational lines, and of course, gender lines, and the intersection of all of them. So these dialogues that we'll be hosting are central to it, to really understanding the role of women in the economy and honestly, the outsized role they have both in the economy and in their households as earners and wealth builders. So thank you for coming and enjoy today's kickoff, and I'll turn it back to Heather.
Great. So just a few logistical comments before we jump in. We will have time for Q&A. We've left plenty of time at the end. So you'll see the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens, and please do submit them as we go. Don't wait to the end. And then the one last thing that I hate to have to bring up, but I know the election is on the top of everyone's minds as we jump into this conversation. However, Aspen is a 501c3 and we're nonpartisan, don't endorse, support, or oppose political candidates and parties. So I'm just trying to be very careful about Aspen's 501c3 status. So I've asked the speakers to refrain from comments that relate to candidates during our conversation today. And that includes in their responses to the questions for all of you. Or from all of you. So I really appreciate your understanding, and let's just jump in. So I'd like to introduce our speakers, and Chabeli and Josie, could you come on screen? Great. Hi. Oh, and you can both go off mute right now. Okay, great. So Josie, I'm going to start with you, Josie. So Josie is a journalist and an author of an amazing new book, Women, Money, Power, The Rise and Fall of Equality. She has been a staff writer for Reuters, The Independent, The Wall Street Journal, and she's also a regular contributor to the BBC, The Washington Post, MSNBC, and I could go on, but I'm going to stop there. Josie is currently an associate professor at Columbia University, and she's the founding editor of The Persistent, a digital journalism platform that's lifting up women's voices, ideas, and perspectives. The Persistent was founded just earlier this year by former New York Times editor Francesca Donner. So really excited to have you here, Josie. Also, one of my other favorite people is Chabeli Carrazana, an economy and childcare reporter for the 19th. So I'm sure most of you know the 19th, but in case you don't, they're an award-winning independent newsroom that focuses on gender policy and politics. Chabeli got her start with the Miami Herald and the Orlando Sentinel, and she's been recognized as a finalist for several awards, including the Livingston Award and the Online Journalism Awards for her reporting on the economy and on childcare. She's also featured in Breaking the News, which we'll be talking about later in our conversation, so I'll just put a pin in that. So let's just start with you, Josie. So, I'm a huge fan of your book. Just this weekend, my mom stole my copy, so I couldn't hold it up because she started reading about the story of when she was having kids and she was saying how it was helping her understand why she didn't go on to be a CEO. So in it, you share the history of women in the economy and you talk about the barriers that women have faced over time. I love how you really then go into how different women over time have challenged those legal, political, and cultural norms. So I thought maybe it'd be helpful if you could just lift up one of those stories and talk to us a little bit about how it pertains to our women in the economy today.
Sure. Yes. Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you to Aspen FSP. It's just such a delight to be here. And, I feel like it's always important to have these conversations, but perhaps particularly now. So really honored to be here and to share a virtual stage with Chabeli as well. So yeah, my book, Women, Money, Power, came out in March. It was obviously a labor of love. I've been a journalist for about 15 years. In the latter half of my career, I've really covered that intersection between women, money, and power. So women, the economy, the labor market, things like the gender pay gap, the women's labor force participation, all of these measures of progress and lack thereof that are keeping so many of us up at night. The reason I wrote the book, though, was because I do sometimes feel like we spend so much time dwelling on the problems of the present without recognizing that they are so fundamentally rooted in the past. And I do firmly believe that the stories of the past can help us to understand the context of where we are today. And I think that's really, really important. So, as Heather mentioned in that lovely introduction just there, I profile so many women. It's such a privilege to be able to do so in the book, from the Rosie the Riveters, who obviously came into the male-dominated labor market during the Second World War and proved that they were just as capable of doing a man's job than any man, to, Betty Friedan and Shirley Chisholm, and of course, Lily Ledbetter, who we recently lost. Muriel Siebert, the first woman who was able to buy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, the list goes on and on. But one woman who I just want to take, a few seconds to highlight, because she's not a household name, but I think her story helps us to understand the context of so much of what we're talking about today, was a lady named Catherine Dexter McCormick, who was one of the most ardent advocates of birth control in this country in the early 1900s, really a time when birth control was not part of, the vocabulary of the everyday person. But she was somebody who really understood this extremely tight link between economic independence and reproductive freedom. And I think as we have this conversation about women in the economy, the thing that I really want to highlight and that I want to emphasize is that so many things are linked to economic power and economic independence. And that's why having this conversation and keeping it to an hour is going to be so challenging, because there are so many different permutations of where we could go, so many different rabbit holes to go down. But I truly believe that reproductive rights and healthcare are inextricably linked to economic rights. And Catherine was amazing. Her story is stranger than fiction. I'm such a huge fan of everything she stood for. She essentially, long story short, ended up providing most of the funding for the research and development that went into making the first oral contraceptive pill a reality in this country. But more than that, she had all kinds of creative ways of enabling access to reproductive healthcare to women. She, at one point, she traveled to Europe and she bought diaphragms from medical goods suppliers, and she smuggled them into the linings of her coats and jackets, and she brought them back into the US as kind of contraband. Just an amazing visionary woman, and I think that her story can teach us so much and can inspire us in such a profound way, especially considering the current news cycle.
I have so many questions and things I want to ask you, but I'm going to hold them and now turn to Chabeli because I really want to bring you into the conversation. But thank you so much, Josie, and I loved that part of your book. So Chabeli, you were an early reporter for 19th, and you're featured, and your dog is featured in Breaking the News. Breaking the News, you know, it went through a lot of growing pains as a news outlet covering stories based on gender, but it's amazing how much you've grown. And you know that I've been with you from the very beginning because I was one of the first people reading it and following the rise of the outlet. But let's just show everyone a short clip, and then I have a whole bunch of questions for you and for Josie. So, Emmy, if you could just run the clip.
So even though it's a very well-known touristy area, the families in need, it's a significant need.
The last big story I worked on before I came to the 19th was a story called Laborland that was about Disney workers. There was some back and forth about whether people wanted to read about poor people and about whether that was even our readership and whether we should focus more on the middle class or try to bring the middle class in. And yeah, sure, but that wasn't really what I wanted to write about. This problem does not stop being relevant because it cannot be relevant to someone in the middle class or the upper class. And I think part of the reason it continues to exist is because the middle class or the upper class don't find it relevant to them. I know Kelly's asking about the pandemic. You all were working or not working? Yeah. Your husband? Yeah.
We were working at the flea market, and the flea market just shut down. I've told my husband several times I wish they would put, like, on food stamps, like a diaper allowance.
Yeah.
Or something, you know, on there just for even one pack.
When your income is just so low that you're struggling just to provide for your children, it's really hard to get that extra up to buy the amount of diapers and wipes you need.
You know, the issue with poverty reporting sometimes is people just want to be like, you know, look at how hard these people's lives are, but also like, look how hard they're working to try to get, you know, to move ahead, and look how hard it is.
Like, am I even fit to be a mom? And then you have to think about it like, yeah, I love these kids. I can give them love. Just because I can't put diapers on them doesn't mean I'm not worthy of being their mother.
Yeah.
Amazing. I just wanted to keep watching. So just saying for folks, if you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend it. So Chabeli, you have reported so much on how the economy is not working for millions of women, especially women of color and women, older women, younger women, immigrants, like so many women that face one or more identities in addition to gender that keep them from thriving. So let's just talk about, like, what do you see as the key barriers based on your reporting that are really keeping women from getting ahead right now in our economy?
Well, thank you for that, Heather, and to Aspen FSP for having us. I'm really excited to be here talking about this. And I mean, it's such an important, critical issue that just we can't talk about enough. And, you know, part of that documentary and that clip in particular gives you a little bit of a window into some of these systems that are just so fundamentally broken. You see that mom talking about SNAP, food stamps doesn't cover diapers, right? The system that is supposed to be for low wage people, the majority of whom are women, isn't covering some of these basic needs, diapers, formula, things like that, right? And so there's a lot of different ways, but I want to use maybe the pandemic as our vehicle for talking about this a little bit, because we have this moment in early 2020 where a lot of the ways that the economy does not work for women are suddenly spotlighted really clearly. So at the beginning, so we have cast your minds back to March of 2020, we have people losing jobs at a really, really high clip at the start of the pandemic, but the majority of those folks were women. And it was the first time that we had more women than men losing jobs during a recession in the United States. That had never happened before. And it was actually the very first story we published at the 19th was about why that was happening, what was going on behind that, because I don't think folks realized what sort of the context of that was. And so there's two big buckets that I want to talk about as to why that happened. One of them is sort of this issue of 50 years out from this, when women really became a significant part of the labor force, they are still in the majority of low-wage jobs, in the majority of unstable jobs. And those are the jobs that disappeared at the beginning of the pandemic. So you had the majority of women as frontline workers, and then you had the majority of them in these low-wage jobs that were cut, service sector jobs. 11 million women lost their jobs between February and May of 2020. And so that is one piece of it where even though there had been progress, there's still a lot of inequity in terms of how women are distributed in our economy. And then the other big one is childcare, right? We saw 1 in 3 childcare providers lose their jobs at the start of the pandemic, 94% of whom, by the way, are women. Majority of them are women of color. Thousands of daycares closed. And so you had, suddenly this construct that we're all in this like Zoom room, you had kids flying around in the background, right? And you had a lot of folks realize for the first time what it means to not have a sturdy childcare infrastructure in this country and how it can impact a person's place in the workforce. You had, a significant amount of women leaving the workforce specifically because they did not have access to childcare. And I should say the United States approaches this in a way that a lot of other countries don't. We do not subsidize childcare at the rate that most other developed nations do. If you go to Denmark, France, Germany, you have a guaranteed childcare spot and you have the government paying for the majority of it. That is not the case here. We have a fundamentally broken system. And that really came to bear during the pandemic, where now we're talking about childcare probably more than ever as a result, because we've realized and we finally made that connection that hasn't been made, that these are all economic issues. They are not women's issues, kitchen table issues. They are economic issues that affect everybody and affect entire economies. And so one other thing I want to add to that is how this layers when we talk about race and gender, because there are also specific challenges that women of different backgrounds are experiencing. And it's important to understand what those are. For Black women, for example, we know that they have the highest labor force participation of any group. They are out there working, but they are concentrated so much in these low-wage jobs. College education is a path that many of them have sought out, again, at higher rates. But the end result has been that Black women hold the highest percentage of student loan debt in this country. So debt is a really big issue and a really big barrier for Black women. And then Latinas are a group that, again, extremely concentrated in low-wage service jobs. They had the highest unemployment rate during the pandemic, 20% at one point, which is really significant. And then they also have really significant caregiving responsibilities. So one of the things we've seen with Latinas is they've sought out small businesses, wanting to be small business owners. The problems there around access to capital, banking relationships, or these historical challenges that Josie was talking about really have come to bear for Latinas, where they, similar to Black women, are seeking a path out, but the system is blocking them at in different places. And so those are important barriers to understand, and we haven't really, as a country, layered gender and race in that way to really get at what is the core problem here. And I will say, I mean, access to childcare and paid family and medical leave, those are two kind of low-hanging fruit policy solutions that would really get at a lot of this. So there are ways to address some of these big systemic, maybe overwhelming seeming problems. But I think now is when we're really having really substantive conversations around how do we do that and how do we address some of these issues.
That's super helpful, Chabeli. I just want to kind of comment on one of the first things you said, which was, you know, women, we were tracking just about women dropping out of the workforce during COVID. You know, at the time, I was part of this network called Closing the Women's Wealth Gap, and we were talking in December of 2019 about really trying to lift up the data, saying, wow, women are in the US are half the workforce. It's the first time in our countries, you know, since we've been tracking it, we're making these huge strides. And then women dropped out in historic rates. Today, we're back to where women are now half the workforce. We're more likely to be working than ever before. It's still, we're in this, and Black women and women of color have always been in the workforce. They've had to be, and now we all have to be. And we are, women are playing this huge economic role. To your point too about graduating from college and starting businesses as well, like women are more likely to be graduating, more likely to be starting businesses than men, especially true for women of color. And then there's this third piece where we are like that women's control of financial assets has tripled to $30 trillion just in this last decade. So all of this to say is we know we are all playing this huge role in the economy, but we never talk about the struggles we have as economic issues. Like, why is that? We never talk about childcare and paid leave as key economic issues. So like, I just want you both to dig into that a little bit more. Why is that? Why do other countries get it and our policymakers and leaders don't?
I just want to actually take a moment to just thank Chabeli for like spelling that all out in such vivid detail, because everything you said, I just completely agree with. And I think it's so important to make those logical connections and to really understand that, you know, COVID-19 was, of course, it was a huge disaster and a crisis, but ultimately it was a litmus test, right? And it was an opportunity for experimentation, and it could have been this amazing opportunity to shake up the way that our economies are structured and the way in which we approach things like childcare, and the way in which childcare is not considered a public utility in this country. This was our opportunity to change that. And I, for one, I'm afraid that we're missing that window and we're missing that opportunity. So I really appreciate you, you know, spelling that out and sketching, making that kind of picture really clear for us. The other thing I was just going to pick up on that was that I think it's really important to dwell on the number of women who dropped out of the labor force, but I think it's equally important to dwell on the number of women who didn't drop out of the labor force, right? And that kind of speaks to your point about the childcare crisis and about you know, the extent to which, again, it's just a sort of silent struggle that so many women, particularly women of color, particularly certain demographics of women, are facing. And so when I see headlines, Heather, like the one you mentioned about, you know, us now, the US now being at a record in terms of women's labor force participation, and when I see that headline being framed as a marker of progress, I think it's dangerous, because it's only really telling half the story. And what I see when I see that headline is, you know, a headline next to it that says that, yes, that's true, but Pew Research also shows us that in terms of unpaid labor, women are still picking up the vast majority, regardless of income level, or almost regardless of income level. And so, you know, I think that we it's our responsibility in this moment, maybe more than ever before, to recognize that these sort of monolithic generalizations about all women and women's labor force participation and the gender pay gap or whatever it is can actually backfire. And it's sort of our responsibility to understand those nuances and to understand not just the quant data that is so easy to distill into a headline, but also the qualitative stories that kind of underpin everything that's going on. You know, no two jobs are created equal either, right? I mean, if we're talking about women's labor force participation in white collar secure jobs that offer good benefits and decent childcare, that's one thing. But the types of jobs that are encompassed with this figure around women's labor force participation are also, you know, highly unstable jobs that don't offer the kinds of benefits that women deserve and women should have, and everyone deserves and everyone should have. And so I just think it's sort of human nature to want to have a good news story after the last 10 years of bad news in terms of women in the economy. But I'm always hesitant to really buy into that.
Good, helpful. Chabeli, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think fragility, right, is the word that comes to mind when I see some of that, because we know how quickly we can fall off from that. From the point that you made, Heather, in December 2019, women were more than half of the workforce, and then 3 months later, all of that had been, you know, had dissolved. And so, how do we sustain it long term? How do we create sort of that foundation? We are really in this country at the beginning of that conversation of what that foundation looks like. And, you know, I'll talk about childcare because childcare is part of my beat and something I cover a lot. But the way that we think about childcare in this country is so different, right? We divorce early childcare education from K through 12, which is not really the way that most other countries address this issue. And so fundamentally, at those first 5 years are going to be a period of potential instability for those parents. And because these traditional beliefs around who does the care are still very much with us, we see that strain fall on women in a way that doesn't really happen in other countries, because they have just structured it completely differently and think about it completely differently. And I think, you know, there's elements of this that are about representation, that are about who is making decisions. It's something, I saw the statistic the other day, something like 8% of legislators are moms with minor children, which, you know, is certainly not representative of the country. And those are the people that are putting forward some of these policies, right? Because they understand it and they live it. And so representation is a part of the problem in our country, and also just kind of our general mentality around it's almost like we created this economy, you know, decades ago with one idea of how Americans interact with the workforce and who is in the workforce. And we haven't caught up to the reality that actually it's changed quite significantly. And the people in this workforce are very different now, and the needs are different. And so I think we're still playing catch up on some of that, but yeah.
And if I can just jump in really quickly, one story that kind of springs to mind to illustrate that point that you were just talking about is a story that I actually tell in the prologue of my book, and I'll make it super short. But one of the reasons I decided to ultimately write the book was because I had the opportunity to interview the CEO of a large Fortune 500 company off the record at the beginning of the pandemic. And it was off the record, so I'll never be able to say who it was, but it was someone who had been at the highest echelons of business in this country for decades, super smart, you know, a lot of business acumen, very educated. And I asked this person why he thinks the gender pay gap still exists and why it's barely moved over the last 2 decades. And he said to me that what I had to understand was that sometimes when a woman has a baby and briefly leaves the paid labor market to take a maternity leave, when she comes back, she's just not as professionally ambitious as she was. And it was just the simplicity with which he drew that conclusion, the way in which he seemed to be placing the onus of deeply complex and entrenched systemic inequality, placing the onus on women to fix that by simply making a different decision. And the implication that there was actually a choice to be made, right? And that it was a free choice to be made, and that the way that women decide to structure their careers and their jobs has anything to do with their actual choice, and just his inability to recognize that there are so many parameters and forces and structural factors that contribute to the way in which women work was just, to me, mind-blowing.
Yeah. And just to tie a couple pieces together, so we, as you guys both know, we did 150 interviews and national surveying to try to talk to women directly about how to build an economy that works for them. And I think one of the key issues that came up again and again when we dug into this issue of what is causing occupational segregation, why is it women are ending up in these low wage jobs, we all kind of jump to it's discrimination, but really it's women having to work around broken systems. So one of the big issues that I heard over and over, big stories, was just how women were having to choose to go into flexible jobs or part-time jobs because they didn't have childcare, they couldn't afford childcare, their salaries didn't make sense for them to, so they're doing the juggle that we all know. And if they're in a part-time job, then they probably don't have benefits. Then they probably aren't getting health insurance and retirement savings. And so it's like, it just keeps building, these broken systems build upon themselves. And so when I read that part of your book, Josie, I was like, it just makes you pissed off, because you just feel like, how is it that then men and or people in power are turning back and blaming women for trying to make it through these ineffective systems? So I want to just move us a little bit to thinking about, well, how do we change it? What would the economy look like if it actually worked for women? And I just want to start with kind of framing it by, when I read your book, Josie, I kept thinking, okay, it just seems to be the interplay between policy change, private sector practice change, and narrative change or culture change. So in your book, you talk about the interplay between the pill and then policy changes related to women controlling their own body, and then how the private sector changed. And yet we've seen how that can all reverse really fast. So what does it take to get to solutions that keep moving us forward? Like, let's just start with kind of generally, how do we keep moving? How do we keep galvanizing change? And then I want to just talk a little bit about what you two see as some of the more specific solutions that we need. So let's just talk about movement building, galvanizing change. What does it take?
I'll keep this short because I'm very, very curious to hear what Chabeli has to say on this point. But, as you say, I tend to focus on these three pillars: the policy, the sort of policy at federal level, the private sector, so corporate policies, what individual employers can do, and then culture. What I think is important to understand is that none of those can afford to wait for the other to be a first mover, right? Companies who are saying, well, I'm not going to implement a generous gender non-specific parental leave because I'm not being mandated to do so by the law, they're just undermining their own success, and they're doing us all a disfavor. Likewise, I often get the question of whether culture comes before legislation or whether legislation comes before culture. And I make the point in the book that in many examples that we've seen over the last 100 years, the law has come into place, and that has been a precursor to culture, which has then followed. But again, I don't think we can afford to presume that one is going to come before the other. I think everything has to happen all at once right now, because ultimately that's the only way that we're going to retain this forward momentum.
Great.
That was so well put. I also can't speak in Josie's British accent, so I feel like everything I say sounds dumb. But
envy.
You mentioned paid leave, and paid leave was actually what I was thinking of with this as well. So we recently wrote a story about caregivers who don't vote because there are so many systems that don't work for them that they don't feel like it's worth it. Feel like candidates don't speak to them, and the mechanics of it, the time, the whatever, is such a challenge. And one of the organizers who I spoke to, who is talking to these caregivers who don't vote and trying to get out the vote, was telling me, 10 years ago, nobody was talking about this issue. I felt completely alone. And she was talking about paid leave. And now we are in a place where states are passing paid leave policies. We've seen pretty significant policies across more than a dozen states at this point. Paid leave is asked in a presidential debate, in a vice presidential debate for the first time ever. We have people talking about different versions of what this could potentially look like. And so all of these cultural and legislative changes are happening at the same time. But as this organizer told me, they happened because we did not shut up about it. We kept talking about it. We kept going out. We kept saying, we will vote on this. And it's like this pressure that builds and builds and builds, and it builds from different places. And that is what galvanizes change. Because at the end of the day, there are people like the person that Josie spoke to who need their hand held to get to that point of realizing, actually, this could potentially, if we had a federal paid leave policy, which, by the way, the United States is one of 7 countries that does not have one. The others are, very small island nations in the Pacific. If we had a federal paid leave policy, that could actually streamline this patchwork we're currently seeing around the country, state to state to state. And it helps companies retain workers. It helps people be better, more productive workers. And it's not a burden on business, because the way we've typically structured it is, it's a system we all pay into. It's an insurance system. So it makes a lot of sense, but it's the hand holding to get there. It's the conversations that take place over years. It's saying this is something we'll vote on. It's talking about it at a presidential level that galvanizes some of that change.
That is great. Thank you, Chabeli. And your accent was beautiful.
It's a Cuban Miami accent. It's a little
exactly. I am just going to encourage everyone to throw your questions in the chat at this point. I'm going to just, I want to ask you one more question, both of you, and then I'm going to start picking up questions from the chat. But just to follow up on this conversation. So while I was with Closing the Women's Wealth Gap, we were part of the National Care Can't Wait campaign. And one of our partners, Paid Leave for All, did incredible polling and continues to do incredible polling, which shows the support for paid leave at 70 to 80%, even in swing states. So why is it with that level of support that we still aren't there? Like, so something else has to be going on. And we all have answers to that, but just what do we need to change if there's that level of support for a policy and it's still, it got stuck in Build Back Better. It didn't get through. Like, what's the big problem here? What do we need to change?
I mean, I think part of it is certainly that the individuals who are in a position to be able to implement these changes have never been in a position where they have had to worry about the cost of a diaper.
Right.
That is just a function of the way that, quite frankly, capitalism works. And so I do believe that we have historically not been good enough at, in Chabeli's words, taking someone by the hand and saying to them, well, look what the individual who is working in the mailroom of your company is having to endure in order to show up for work every day. Look at the, least pay, the lowest paid individual in your organization, who, by the way, makes, maybe 1% of the income that you bring home every year. Look at the individual challenges that they're facing in order to just put their kids through a decent education, get the childcare they need, etc. And I mean, this perhaps sounds a little romantic and maybe stems from the fact that I'm a journalist, but I feel like we need to tell better stories. We need to be able to have those conversations and be more emotive. And of course, cold, hard facts are always going to have a place and are always going to be valuable. But I think that we can achieve more of a dialogue and more of a broader understanding of the extent to which childcare is a fundamental economic issue if we keep talking about it and if we bring it to life in such a way that it resonates, not just with those people who have had to worry about the cost of it in the past.
Yeah. And I do want to give a shout out to iGenPoo with Caring Across Generations and folks at Better Life Lab with New America Foundation, because they are working with artists, you know, writers, producers, this cultural storytellers to try to, you know, just get those narratives into our mainstream dialogues. And I feel like that strategy is so important at this point. So I am getting some questions in. So let's start with the first one. Can you speak to how gender and economics intersect with the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory on the mental well-being of parents?
Oh,
Just
yeah.
a light question.
Do we want another hour for that one in particular?
Yes, yeah.
Sort of, you know, this idea of parental stress. I mean, let's look at it just as cost, right? This is, cost is top of mind for me because this is, I think, the election of cost, right? We're looking at how much this is an issue for folks and it's really important. It's something that people are voting on and are looking at very closely. And so it's been something I've thought about a lot, but sort of this idea of the burden of cost, particularly with childcare. The cost of childcare has surpassed the rate of inflation over the past 30 years. It's more costly than a year of in-state tuition in more than 30 states, something like 35 states. It is more than a lot of people's rent. It's more than a lot of people's mortgage. It's pretty soon going to be more than my mortgage. And so it is such a stressor on families' budgets, abilities to move around. I spoke to a mom, I think 2 years ago now, in the middle of the pandemic, who talked about, you know, making decisions around where she was going to live, around whether they were going to have more children, around essentially how they were going to structure the rest of their lives, completely because of the immense burden that childcare was for them. They had been on a waiting list for a year or two, couldn't find a place, were driving 45 minutes an hour just to get to the nearest childcare center, which wasn't even the one they wanted, and weren't sure that they loved having their child there, right? So many factors that build into that stress. And so this idea of cost, I think, is part of the reason that this is such an economic issue, right? Because if we were able to free up some of those costs and lower that burden, we'd lower that stress. But we'd also free people up to make better decisions, or the decisions that they want to make, to even have choice. That's a big idea I think about a lot with childcare coverage, which is that the costs and the options are so limited that people do not have choice. So they cannot make the choice to change jobs, change cities, try to go for that promotion, or leave the labor force if they want to, because those choices are taken from them. And so I think that is one of those really big stressors when you talk to moms in particular in the workforce. And at the end of the day, understanding that these are not about individual choices, which is, I think, is part of the problem around how we think about paid leave, how we think about childcare. It's your family's problem and you need to figure it out individually, but there is actually sort of a holistic collective solution that we could approach that would help people actually be able to make individual choices. And so I think that fundamental thought process around how we approach it is part of the reason that we're sort of in this problem. But yeah, cost and childcare, I think it's been very short-sighted of us to not see that as an economic issue for so long. And we're only, again, at the start of that now.
And
sorry, go ahead, Heather.
Go ahead, Josie.
I was just going to say the one thing I would add to that is, of course, cost. As Chabeli said, everything I agree with, but also just the whiplash of the last few years in terms of, you know, the pandemic could have been this gateway to a new world of work. It could have been an opportunity for us to have a newfound openness to hybrid working, to remote working, to job shares, to essentially just chipping away at these age-old parameters of the way that we've always thought about work. And we saw hints of that. We really did. You know, when so many of us were forced to work from home, we were able to demonstrate that productivity did not suffer in a meaningful way, that we were still able to produce what we were producing before the pandemic. And I think that what we're seeing in the data that's coming out now is that that was actually an amazing opportunity for many women, particularly mothers of young children, to find a foot in the labor market, because they were able to have access to those types of jobs that didn't require them to be in a physical office 5 days a week. And then what followed that, of course, was return to work mandates.
Right.
And I mean, there are many things that upset me a lot at the moment, but the return to work mandate is certainly on that list, because I think in many cases it's not evidence-based. And it's just this sort of snapping back to the way that things were, because they've always been that way. Whereas what it actually, could have been is an opportunity for us to change the nature and the structure of work to accommodate workers, right? Revolutionary. And I think that I've spoken to many mothers of young children who were sort of filled with hope when they thought that this would be the beginning of something new in terms of the world of work. And then to be essentially told, actually, never mind, that door's going to shut in your face again. I think that is something that certainly feeds into what we've been hearing from the Surgeon General.
That's right. I just wanted to flag for us, because we have focused a lot in our conversation about taking care of kids. I hate to be the bearer of, bad news that we all know, but we are all about to enter into like mass sandwich generation experience as elders retire. So it is going to get worse, because elders, the baby boomers are retiring at a faster rate than ever before, and our long-term care and support systems are also broken. So that's a whole nother conversation, but I do want to put a pin in that. And even though it feels really depressing, it does affect men as well. And it's another reason we all have to keep fighting for these policies, because it hurts everyone. If families are stretched we're already stretched beyond capacity with childcare. So you add long-term care and taking care of parents on top of it, it's just untenable. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is just that, oh gosh, I've lost it. I've forgotten. So on that note, maybe that's as I'm on the edge of the baby boomer generation. On that note, let me just grab some questions here. How does universal pre-K fit into solving the childcare crisis? What are the barriers to having it, and what are other countries doing? And Chabeli, you kind of, touched on that, but maybe you could go a little deeper.
Yeah, universal pre-K is a really interesting one, because again, this is going to require us to get to a place where we are in agreement around what kind of investment we want to put into something, right? And at the end of the day, if we want to do it well, there needs to be a pretty significant investment. And we have seen attempts at universal pre-K in different parts of the country that have, that we can essentially learn from. I'm thinking of an example in New York City where all of the universal pre-K slots were only at these pre-Ks and not at childcare centers. So the way that childcare functions, these older children, these 3 and 4-year-olds, are really subsidizing care for the younger kids. And when you take those kids out of the childcare center and into a different setting, now you had all these centers, a lot of them in low-income neighborhoods, that are closing because they cannot afford to stay open. So, I think it is a system that if we want to stand it up, we need to think really hard about the way that we structure it, how we go about it, but the return on it can be really significant, right? Because then we are getting away from this break again that we have here, where we don't have it, that we don't have in other countries, where we are only guaranteeing spots and access to education for kids after the age of 5, but now we are expanding that to younger kids, which will also help their parents and help those kids, right? I think so much of this conversation around childcare, we focus a lot, obviously, around the economic costs and the challenge for the workforce, but the benefits to children, to be able to have that kind of access to all children, right? Because we also know what's happening in terms of, racial differences in terms of what kids get access and what kids don't, to open that up could have really long-term returns, long-term returns for those children, for educational outcomes, for the kind of jobs that they seek out, if we're thinking about, you know, how we fix this thing long-term. So I think universal pre-K is a pathway. It's just a pathway that we're going to have to commit to doing well. We cannot kind of cobble it together because it is complex and it does touch on other parts of the childcare ecosystem. And again, it's another matter of how many dots do we need to connect for folks for them to see this is something that could work here in the way it has worked in other places.
And I think that's a perfect segue, Chabeli. Thank you for, you know, just pointing out the complexity of it. But hey, we have solved a lot of really tough problems in this country. If people make it a priority, we will fix it. So this next question, usually the decision makers don't consume media with the stories that will, just my question moved, sorry. Usually the decision makers don't consume media with the stories that will impact real people. How do we get them to pay attention to these or promote stories in media that they do consume? Good question. What do you two think?
It's a hard one. Well, I mean, I'll try to take a stab at it because it is a difficult question, right? It's sort of a perennial question for journalists. How do we get people to pay attention to our work? But I will say, you know, I've been at the 19th since we launched, and before that, there wasn't really an outlet that was focused on gender and political coverage the way that we've focused on it, and we've tried to make those connections in a way which for me as a journalist has been really exciting and liberating, because it, you know, sometimes it's hard to think about, well, what's the gender slice of this? But also it's really invigorating when we find it and when we can point it out in a way that it hasn't been pointed out. And you start to see people connect those dots in a way they haven't before. I remember a story we did early on the minimum wage and why the minimum wage is actually a gender issue, because the vast majority of those workers are women of color. And there is value in continuing to do that and continuing to push on how these issues are racial issues, they're gender issues, they're gender and race issues. And as a media environment, I don't think we've always done that, right? There's a lot of sort of general reporting around some of these topics, but now that we are seeing, you know, places like us, The Persistent, other outlets that are really trying to make those inroads into, well, this is actually how this affects this group in a way that you haven't thought about, that has been really valuable. And I've been really heartened to see in the past 4 years how much more coverage there has been on a lot of these gender topics. And so I think it takes all of us pushing ourselves a little bit more on doing that more in-depth work, because it doesn't exist. It hasn't existed. And it really can help do the hand-holding that we need to do.
Yeah, I think this speaks to a much broader question about the role that media is playing and the extent to which the whole model of media has to change if it wants to continue to serve the role that it has always served, or that it should always have served, which is to educate people and to inform them and to essentially promote democratic values and to make society more functioning and cohesive and smart, right? And I must admit that a few years ago, I was really discouraged by large media organizations, established legacy newsrooms, turning their attention away from issues around gender, around systemic inequality, things like the New York Times discontinuing the In Her Words newsletter, things like the Lily closing down. But at the same time, you know, I have loved to watching the emergence of newsrooms like the 19th. The movie, by the way, is brilliant. Just another plug in case you need another one, but I don't think anyone does after seeing that clip. And then also, of course, my own experience with The Persistent and with Francesca Donna, you know, it's not scary hauling yourself into this coverage area. because it can feel like the odds are stacked against you. But when you really put your mind to it, and I'm sure Chabeli can attest to this, the rewards are huge. And when you write a story, or when you cover something, or when you mention somebody who has not traditionally had their place in the mainstream media, or has not traditionally had their story told, it changes something. And it really kind of restores your faith in the work that we're doing, and in readers, and it really kind of gives you that inspiration to keep going, because ultimately we have to, if we want to change something.
So that is the perfect segue into my last question. So I wanted you two to just talk about some key takeaways about just this conversation, how to build an economy that works for women. But I really want you to say it just as Josie did. So you can think of another one, Josie, but just tell me what brings you hope. Like, where can we all be hopeful? Because sometimes this data is so overwhelming that we want to curl up in a ball. But Chabeli, I'm going to start with you. What gives you hope?
I am really hopeful. I'm really hopeful in this moment. There are so many things that have changed in the last 4 years, especially. I mean, we started this conversation talking about the pandemic, and I think there is so much that we have learned in that time frame around the invisible work that so many women are doing, about all of these gaps we have, these knowledge gaps we have around sort of these layered inequalities with race and gender, and how much more research and work needs to be done for us to better understand it. But we are now at a place where we're saying this is valuable. Let's go after it. Let's figure it out. Like I mentioned, after the pandemic, we saw a dozen states invest in their childcare systems. We saw the largest one-time federal investment in childcare ever in this country. And that made people see what was possible in a way that we have never done. And that is valuable. I think that will have long-term returns. You're seeing childcare show up in things like the Farm Bill, the CHIPS Act, right? You're seeing states pass paid leave policies. You're seeing women at the heads of some of the largest labor unions in the country. The AFL-CIO has its first woman president. The SEIU has its first Black woman president. These change makers are in these positions. And so for me, and now, 2 weeks out on the doorstep of an election where we've talked about care more than ever, both parties have talked about it. I mean, we have dueling child tax credit proposals. I mean, who could have imagined that 4 years ago? And so I don't think we turn back, because people have seen what is possible when we push. We just have to keep pushing.
Thank you. Josie?
Everything that she said. Also, I think that it's always important to acknowledge that progress might not be occurring at the rapid clip at which we would ideally want it to occur, but progress is nonetheless progress. And if the trajectory is there, and if we're heading in the right direction, I think we have to be hopeful. I think that's our duty. I'm encouraged by the fact that we are making these connections, as Chabeli says. I feel like now more than ever, we are acknowledging that childcare is a core economic imperative. We are sort of, in our collective brain, I feel like the synapses are firing everywhere. And I feel like we are having this conversation right across the US, in boardrooms, outside schools, but also at kitchen tables. And that is what I find so encouraging. The work is obviously still there, and a ton needs to be done, and policy is inadequate, and corporate protections are non-existent in many cases. But I am so encouraged by what I'm hearing and the noise that is being made. And I am just hopeful that others feel the same.
Love that. Well, thank you so much, Chabeli, Josie, Joanna, and my team at the Financial Security Program. Before everyone drops off, I want to give you a couple quick assignments. Sign up for the 19th and start following Chabeli's writing and share it on social. Order Josie's book. It's amazing. And subscribe to her Substack. Watch Breaking the News. That's a pretty easy sell, but it is available on all the major streaming services. And then subscribe to The Persistent. I'm one of the first subscribers and very honored to be so, but it's a great, it's just a great place to go for ideas and perspectives. You're going to get a survey at the end of the call. Please do fill it out. It will help us as we start planning our next dialogue. And we really hope you'll join us for that next post-election as we dig into what it all means for the future of women in the economy. And thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.